I woke up one night when I was 12 because I dreamt that my older brother got into a car accident. I got out of bed and wandered downstairs to the kitchen to get something to drink. My mother was sitting there and asking me why I was awake. I told her I had a bad dream. I went to go get a glass of water when there was a ring at our door. My mother went to go see who could be there in the middle of the night. The two police officers asked if they could come inside for a moment. I couldn't hear what they were talking about because I was still in the kitchen and they were in the hallway. After the two officers left, my mother came back to the kitchen, completely pale, and told me that I should go to bed now. I asked her what was wrong, and she informed me that my brother had actually been in a car accident and that she needs to go wake up my dad so they can go to the hospital. When I pointed out that this was the exact bad dream that I had before waking up, she only looked at me for a couple of seconds. I prepared myself for comments like, "Don't be silly and go back to bed," but instead she said, "Me too." So basically, we both had the same fucking dream of my brother having a car accident. And we both wake up minutes before the police come over to tell us it actually happened. My brother survived with some minor injuries, and we saw the photos of the accident in the newspaper the next day. It looked exactly like it did in my dream, even down to the most minute details. The way he lost control over the car, where it flipped over, and the tree that made the vehicle come to a stop. Even today, my mother and I talk about this. Nobody else believes us when we tell the story. Alright everybody, welcome back to more Reddit stories. For a long time, I feel like each of the Reddit videos that I've made have more or less been the same, like each video never really followed a specific theme. For that reason, each video's stories from now on, I think, are going to start revolving around more specific topics, starting today with Unexplained Childhood Experiences. No exaggeration, this video contains some of the most mind-bending stories I've ever seen on Reddit. I'm pumped to jump into this one, so without wasting any more time, grab a snack, get comfortable, and shut the blinds. Not my experience, but my mom and aunt's. They grew up in the Hollers in eastern Kentucky. One night when they were 7 or 8 years old, they were sleeping in their grandma's house when my aunt awoke to someone whispering her name from the end of the bed. She said it sounded so terrifying that she was afraid to look, but kept doing so. She shook my mom enough to wake her up, and my mom, too, heard it calling my aunt's name. They had the blankets over their head, and my mom finally got the courage to look down to the end of the bed. She said there were 2 male figures, bloody, slightly decaying, and looking like they had been in a car accident. The figures stood at the end of their bed all night, whispering their name while my mom and aunt hid under the blankets. The figures eventually vanished before dawn. My mom and aunt swear truth to this story still today. I've asked them to tell it to me many times over the years, and it never changes. My aunt hates talking about it because she thinks it could, quote, invite them in. Anyway, when they told my grandpa about it that next morning, he said that he knew several people who had similar experiences and that those figures were called Bloody Bones and Rawhead in that area. A simple Google search will tell you that these figures existed in Southern folklore. When I was 9 or 10, my dad took me to visit with an older hunting buddy friend of his. My parents were divorced, and my dad lived in another part of the country, so while I had known this guy since I was a toddler, I didn't share the same common interests as either of them. The older friend was a gun dealer and had lots of catalogs. This was before the internet was in wide use. To order bullets, magazines, guns, etc., and they often spent hours going through listings to determine what they wanted to order. We got there fairly early, and my dad said that after an hour or two, we'd all go to Hardee's for breakfast before going to shoot clay birds. Now, I'm a youngin'. I don't care much about guns or hunting for sport, and am just incredibly bored. So I start wandering around the house, reading my video game magazines that I brought with me, and very quickly, that hour or two has passed, and they're still down there. I ask if they're going to leave anytime soon, and the friend suggests that I check the refrigerator in the kitchen and see if there's anything I want to eat. I look through the fridge and find nothing. However, on the kitchen table, I see an apple and decide that will be appetizing enough to hold me over. As I pick up the apple and prepare to take a bite, his wife steps in and tells me, "Don't eat that, everything in the bowl is wax." I stop myself and thank her for warning me, and continue to wander around the house, burning time until we can actually get going and get some food. Maybe another 30 minutes later, I go back to the basement where they're still going through the catalogs and ask when we're going to Hardee's. My dad's friend asks if I'm still hungry after going through their fridge. I tell him that I was going to eat an apple, but his wife told me that it was wax before I made the mistake. Both of them give me a blank stare, and after about 20 seconds, my dad explains that his friend's wife recently passed away. I then go back through the house to try and prove to myself that they were just joking with me, but sure enough, she was nowhere to be found. Roughly 30 years later, before he passed away, my dad still insisted that I must have imagined it. But I didn't. I know I didn't. I was young, 5 through 7, somewhere in there. I was sleeping in between my parents for whatever reason. I woke up, and I remember the clock reading around 4 a.m. There was something standing by the window, looking out into the front yard. It looked like a man in a brown wool robe, about 6'4" or so. I started to stir and sat up in bed, and the thing turned and looked at me. Extremely pale white skin, lots of really pronounced wrinkles, and the face drooped like it was melting down into a really pointy chin, almost similar to a scream mask, but with all of the features of a living being. Its mouth was hanging open and its eyes were wide, almost like it was worried or frightened. It kept its gaze on me while it moved away from the window, in front of the bed, and out the open bedroom door. The second it exited the room, the lights turned on their own, and both of my parents jumped up on either side of me, breathing heavily like they'd both just woken up from a nightmare. To be clear, I was fully able to move during this. I don't think it was sleep paralysis, but I'm not sure what it could have been other than some kind of demon or really fucking ugly ghost. I've never seen it since, but I can still picture it clear as day. Now, I'm inclined to write this one off as just a simple nightmare, but the original poster seems to emphasize that they were definitely awake when this happened. Again, they were moving around and everything, so it doesn't sound like it was sleep paralysis. I wanted to bring up the fact that the human brain tends to search for human faces in inanimate objects, but that doesn't explain how this thing apparently moved around, left the room, turned on the lights, and the strange effect that it had on the parents. I don't know, I guess my best guess here is that this is some sort of a strange false memory, but I'm interested to hear what your guys' thoughts are on this one. It was my nanny's youngest son's birthday, and I was 4 years old. I didn't fully understand why at the time, but I hadn't seen my nanny in roughly 6 months, and had just returned to her that week. She mentioned that it was her youngest son's birthday today, and I asked if I'd get to play with him, which immediately made her cry. After a moment, I moved past that and started hanging out around the kitchen, when the neighbors popped in, as well as my nanny's husband, along with the youngest son. He was now 3 years old and still didn't talk much, but he smiled and let a balloon go from his hand, and it flew to the ceiling. Only a moment later, my nanny asked where the balloon came from. I told her that her youngest son had brought it inside with him and that he let it go up there. She started crying again. As an adult, I understand that the youngest son died at age 2. He and my nanny were hit by a distracted driver. My nanny survived but had serious injuries. Her son died the day after the collision. I know what I saw in the kitchen, and I have no rational way of explaining it. I was young, maybe 8. Just so you know, I always go to sleep in my bed, and I'd never, ever fall asleep on the couch. My grandpa died, and we got back from his funeral. That night, I went to bed in my room as usual, but I woke up in the middle of the night on the living room couch. When I looked up, I saw my grandpa. It wasn't scary or anything. At the time, it felt natural. He didn't say anything, but there was this understanding between us. I went back to my room and went back to sleep. I would have assumed it was a dream, but it was so vivid and real that it stuck with me for years, especially since I woke up on the couch, which made the moment stick out even more in my mind. It wasn't even a "I saw a ghost" moment. It was just a weird, vivid memory that seemed so normal at the time that I didn't think anything strange of it. When I was about 20, I told my mom that story, and she said, "Was it the day of his funeral? Because I saw his ghost that night too." That fucked my shit up. When I was little, my dresser, it was long but pretty short, sat against the wall with one of the ends pointed to my door. That dresser is heavy, an old wood one with all sorts of kid crap neatly arranged on top. Since it was in my bedroom, the floor was carpet, and I always slept with the door closed. One night, with no explanation, the dresser tipped over. But instead of falling forward, it fell 180 degrees to the side, falling in front of my door, making everything on top spill over to the side. My mom ran to come and see what happened, but couldn't open the door as it was being blocked by the dresser. Eventually, with her pushing and me pulling on the dresser, she was able to slip in and move the dresser out of the way. Nothing was damaged, not even the glass figurines I had. My dad helped put it upright the next day, and we moved on. Years later, I remembered the incident and asked my mom about it, expecting to learn that I blew it out of proportion and it only fell forward or something like that. Nope. She remembered that night as well. Now, if you're telling yourself that this one doesn't sound too crazy, let me clarify a couple things. First of all, I want to remind you that the user explained that the dresser was both long and short. With this in mind, somebody in the replies of the post asked this question. "I'm confused as to how the dresser fell. Did you mean it tipped over onto its side and was perpendicular to the floor, sticking straight up? Or do you mean it fell onto its front but was spun around sideways to be perpendicular to the wall instead of just in front of it?" They then reply by stating that it was spun perpendicular to the wall. So this long, short dresser somehow ended up on its side without anyone else in the room? Maybe there's some kind of an explanation here, but I'm not seeing it. About 5 years ago, my parents were sitting out on the back porch on a summer night. Out of the corner of her eye, my mom saw a person-sized white translucent figure float by a tree. She asked my dad if he saw it too, and he said he did. He's a tough guy, but he was really freaked out, and so was she, so they both went inside. The next morning, my mom was walking by the tree where she saw the figure, and she noticed a very old-looking earring sitting on top of the dirt. She doesn't wear earrings, and it wasn't the kind of earring I would wear, but it looked like it belonged to an old lady, and it had just been dropped there. My mom brought it inside and put it in her jewelry box for some reason. The next day, it was sitting in the middle of the basement floor. From then on, I started hearing footsteps and whispering in my room at least once a week until I moved out. I woke up one morning and the shoelace from one of my sneakers had completely vanished. Just on one shoe. The lace on the other shoe was still there. I do not ever remove the laces of my shoes. The shoes were right beside me by my bed all night. I have always been a ridiculously light sleeper. The slightest sound wakes me up, and nothing woke me up that night. Moreover, the door was closed to my room, the floorboards creaked whenever anyone stepped on them, and the room was small. I 100% would have noticed someone coming in. Nothing else was disturbed in the entire house. Nothing had been moved or taken, no signs of forced entry. My mom noticed nothing all night, and she also has no sense of humor. There was nobody in the house aside from me and her, and nobody but us had the keys. We didn't have mice, and there were no traces of the missing lace anyway. There is absolutely no way that shoelace could have gone missing. My mom remembers it well, but as soon as I mention it, she immediately doesn't want to talk about it because it freaks her out. When I was a kid, my mom used to work at a small grocery store, and she went there before breakfast to get fresh foods from the bakery when she had the afternoon shift. Then she used to wake me up for school and ask how I slept, and I used to tell her what dream I had that night, if any. One morning, I told her that I dreamed that two guys broke into the store and they left a red screwdriver on the floor. My mom was shocked because there really was a break-in that night. That's why she couldn't buy stuff for breakfast that morning. However, she couldn't talk with police or colleagues at the time to get more details. I then went to school, and my mom did the afternoon shift, and that evening, when she came home, she told me that the police actually did find a red screwdriver on the scene, which belonged to the burglars. This all happened in Europe, in a small town around the early 90s, so there was no CCTV, and the burglars never got caught. My mom made me fill out a lottery ticket the next day, but never won anything with it, and I've never had any dreams like that since. Before I hit double digits, I don't fully remember what my age was, but I know it was before I was 10, my stepmother's ex came over drunk. He was the biological dad of my step-siblings, who were the ones who let him inside. He was raving about how he was going to kill my dad and the kids who weren't his, which is me and my sister, who was only a couple of months old at the time. I ran to our shared bedroom and hid in the closet. I know, maybe not the smartest move, but I was a scared little kid. The door was open just a crack, so I could see him come into the room a couple of times as my stepmother was trying to get him to leave. I heard a lot of noise at one point, and then I saw the cops come into the room, so I came out of the closet. I went into the kitchen and saw blood on the floor, counters, stove, and there were a few things broken. The ex had tried to fight with my dad, but being drunk did not have the upper hand. My dad, being tired of his BS, didn't work in the ex's favor either. The ex was arrested, and he was the only one who really got hurt that night. The friend who brought him to our house was charged as an accomplice. I have a recurring nightmare that pops up from time to time regarding this story. As a teenager, I could take a bus a few blocks from home that would take me to the local bus station. 2 internet cafes were there. Lucky duck, I got a phone for Christmas, a Nokia 5110. I remember having to charge it for hours before using it before setting its alarm so I could wake up on time for the bus ride to the internet cafes. I wake up the next day. No alarm. Oh, the alarm is set, but I had it set to PM instead of AM. That's okay, I'm only an hour late and we got all day. I walked down to the highway to catch my bus. Traffic was backed up, which seemed weird, then noticed that there was a road closure and had to catch the bus down the road. Okay, did that, caught the bus. The bus drives past the bus stop that I was supposed to be waiting at. Turns out, the bus stop had been totaled, flattened. I asked the bus driver what was up. About an hour and a half ago, a car went straight through the bus stop, killed a guy who was waiting there. If I had set the clock correctly on my phone, I would have been right on time in that spot at that bus stop. Instead, I had a good time at the internet cafe. It really didn't dawn on me how it played out until I reviewed the day later on. I'm more freaked out about it these days than when it actually went down. We've talked about similar stories before where people narrowly avoided death due to seemingly inconsequential decisions or mistakes that they made beforehand. To me, what's most terrifying about these kinds of stories is that there's really nothing unexplainable about them. You never really know what lies ahead of you on the path of life, and we're probably constantly avoiding disaster all day long without even realizing it. I'm a grown woman now, but when I was 11, I lived with my dad, who had just gotten a gig as a temporary principal for a junior high school in a semi-rural area. He had to start the job fairly quickly, so a kind teacher at the school let us rent his basement apartment. It was pretty sweet. The house was right next door to the school. Our landlord was a well-liked teacher with a wife and a daughter my own age. One evening, my dad had to pop out to his office to fix some things. This was in 1999, so we weren't all connected online, but I was lucky to have my own mobile phone, without internet, obviously. I didn't expect to use it as my dad is hearing impaired and usually didn't notice his phone ringing, but anyways, I expected him back in a few hours, so no stress, I'm a big girl. There's a knock at the door, and I can see that it's the landlord. He's also my school teacher, so I open the door and let him in. He just has a few questions, and he sits down on the couch. We talk a little, but I start feeling like something's off. He seems a little drunk. His questions get invasive, and suddenly he gets up to, quote, give me a hug. I don't want a hug, and I got scared and managed to break away. He was trying to keep his grip on me. I actually start moving towards the door, but he blocks me. I am now severely freaked out, and I keep moving around the apartment while small-talking about school and trying not to let my fear show. He's telling me not to be scared and that he's my teacher and just wants to get to know me better. This goes on for about half an hour. My dad suddenly comes home. He also had a bad feeling, and he immediately notices our landlord is drunk and tells him to get out. I told my dad everything, and we kept the door locked from then on. My dad had some acute health issues shortly after, and I had to stay with relatives. After he got well, we moved to a new place. However, a few weeks later, our landlord got arrested. He had been found at a gas station chugging denatured alcohol, and it turned out that he had been abusing his wife and 11-year-old daughter for years. This happened one weekend when I was staying at my grandmother's house. My brother usually came too, but he didn't this weekend, so I had to sleep in the room that we had at her house alone. I had my own room at home, but this one was bigger and just felt ominous in the dark. Anyway, we had a bunk bed. I was on the top bunk, which my brother usually took, watching TV, trying to fall asleep, when the bedroom door opened. The hallway light was on. It was always on at night, and the door cracked in a fashion that you would expect it to if someone was peeking in to check in on you. Like, wide enough for a head to fit in and turn. Only there was no head there. Nothing was there. Then, the moment I realized it was odd, the door slammed shut. I laid there for a few minutes before getting up the courage to see if my grandmom was awake, because I convinced myself that maybe it was her, but I had to check. So I ran into her room, and she was in a deep sleep, dead to the world. I literally couldn't wake her up, so it couldn't have been her. We were the only two people in the house, and I can still see the doorknob turn, the door open, pause, and slam. And that's all we have for today. Thank you guys so much for the continued support. If you guys have any suggestions for future videos or any kinds of stories you'd like to see in the future, be sure to let me know in the comments.